Chers auditeurs,
Dear listeners,
bonjour.
welcome to Comme d'Archi Podcast Season 5.
Saison 5, dans le monde fascinant des architectes.
And in the architectural projects.
Je suis Anne-Charlotte Deponte, passionnée d'architecture et docteur des universités en histoire de l'archi.
I am one of the spokespersons of Anne-Charlotte, who is a PhD in architecture history.
Merci.
Thank you
D'être avec moi aujourd'hui.
to be with us today.
Et
And
maintenant,
now,
lundi en français, place au talent.
and Wednesday, let's talk projects. In English, of course.
Bienvenue dans Comme d'Archi.
Dear listeners, hello and welcome today to our Season 5 sport format on the subject of this summer, which, just over, proved to be a deadly one. This is Esther on behalf of Anne-Charlotte. Pillars have collapsed. In the midst of the shock, let's try to build a reflection in tribute. I never imagined I'd be talking about this journalist one day. Speaking of Gérard Leclercq, brother of the famous French singer, a personality I'd like to take the liberty of excluding from any political affiliation. You know, as you know me well by now, how much I abhor labels. On the subject of Gérard Leclercq, then, I'd like to quote an excerpt from a tribute written by Jean-Bernard Schmidt, director of the W and CFPJ journalism schools, evoking this generation at the dawn of the 2000s, an era of unbridled intensity, marked by Gérard Leclercq, natural and benevolent authority. Gérard trusted young people. He embodied everything our era increasingly hates: curiosity, intellectual finesse, combined with fantasy, a sense of complexity, convictions rather than certainties, commitment rather than militancy, nuance in times that are sorely lacking in it. End of quote. To be honest, I didn't really know this man, but everything quoted here in tribute is eloquent. And if architecture also lost its sense of nuance, what would become of the richness of our cities? Blocks as far as the eye can see, bulldozing the notion of heritage and even architectural discipline? Yet, the climate dictates that we must preserve. And in this age of mid-journey, which multiplies the imagination of the project, I find it hard to believe, and I'm convinced that a visionary, hard-hitting youth at the opposite end of the spectrum from the great absurdities of the present day will take up the baton in the face of the drowning of our values in the mega-political gazpacho that's turning into an unappetizing globibulga. It's been a murderous summer, but everything passes. Ephemerality. What arrogant youth find hard to grasp. But soon we'll have news from Europan. I'm looking forward to discovering the results. And what about you? But, patatras. General Georgelin, whose arrival at the helm of the Notre-Dame construction site was announced by Alexandre Gady in Comme d'Archi Season 1 #4, only 4 days after the fire, the General passed away in the summer of 2023. I confess, faced with the announcement effects at the very moment of the fire in 2019, General or no General, I didn't believe in anything about this reconstruction for 2024. What arrogance, what pretension in the face of almost 900 years of Notre-Dame, I thought. And yet, forcing my admiration, our General seemed to have taken up the challenge just a few days before 2025, even if it was a little short until 2025. And then, bang, the man with the grip that has become a rarity went off the rails. In its tribute, the Élysée evoked an opening date of December 8, 2024. In the face of this tragic death, will the date be kept? The Élysée emphasized, he was a force to be reckoned with. Quoting the general's favorite phrase, living on the surface will punish you in time for having ignored the future which always inherits. A great soldier is gone. Where does modernity fit into all this? he seems to want to tell us again and again. One of the great guarantors of contemporary architecture has also just left us. Allow me, absurdly and totally in vain, to address these few informal words to him. Monsieur Cohen, I've listened to you, I've met you, I've read you. We've barely exchanged 3 words because I was far too shy. I felt crushed by your genius. I've seen a few of your exhibitions. When I was studying art history at the University of Paris 1, led at the time by Gérard Monnier, I perceived a school battle between history at the university and architecture in the teaching units. It was a tug-of-war that saddened me, as I perceived that the architect was claiming sole legitimacy for himself, as I myself had been training in the School of History and its inescapable methodology. Decidedly, the architect was too absorbed to realize what I considered to be a misunderstanding. I was thinking transdisciplinarity. I was dreaming the ecosystem of architecture schools was certainly ready to meet sociology, but history at university, too dusty. Too dusty? Was it a question of dogmatic positioning? I've always hated dogma. If we are to believe Julie Arnaud's article dated April 21st, 2020, À quoi servent les historiens, historiennes de l'architecture? An article inspired by the work of Richard Klein, published in Chronique d'Architecture, the fracture is still not settled. Jean-Louis Cohen, polygraduate and teacher at the École d'Architecture, you've made your mark. You were on the right side. The budding architectural historian in me was totally lacking in self-confidence. I had to make do with your writings. As uninterested in any other groupie attitude, I was even less interested in honors. No regrets. What must be done is done. But you know, I loved walking the walls of the Institut d'Art et d'Archéologie at 3 Rue Michelet, Paris 6, with my great friend Emerance. I loved helping my friends at the Belleville School of Architecture when they had charrette. I probably preferred the daytime routine in the 6th arrondissement, even if it meant banging my empty student stomach in the window of Constance on Rue des Arts, trapped by a perfect chocolate dome, rather than slaloming through misery and dog poop in broad daylight on the Belleville sidewalks around the school. In addition to the noodles that kept me going, in addition to the sidewalks of my apartment on Rue Couronne, I'd already had a magnificent dose of suffering, grief, and poop all too soon. Power and beauty at the manufactured dog too, you might say. With my entrepreneurial family culture, my choice was made. Better to be envied than pitied. The field of history opened up so wide to me. I had no problem reading the project, having fallen into it as a child. Work and destiny would do the rest. You had such a head start, immersed in thought from childhood, and in your ever-increasing research, you remarkably ignored the arc history. You embraced everything. History and architecture intertwined brilliantly. You said that the architectural historian had to avoid becoming a toxic sub-literature designed to maintain the national novel. And that's all there was to it. Over the years, you have become an architect, architectural historian, theorist and critic, holder of a chair in the history of architecture at New York University, NYU, visiting professor at the Collège de France and numerous other institutions around the world, member of the Scientific Councils of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, MoMA, the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, the Berlin Academy of the Arts, and much more. And yet, you were a fervent defender of 20th century architecture. Perhaps it would have taken 10 more like you to make the general public appreciate this fascinating page of history. That said, in your generation, it has to be said, you've done very, very well. You've taken quite a place, or rather a sacred place, that's for sure. Your brilliant lights should have a long life ahead of them. That's probably why I dare to speak to you like this just a few days after your great departure. The last time I saw you, you were being driven through the New York airport on a cart. On your way to Paris, your plane about to take off, a smile on your face, amused by the ride for sure. It was 2019, just before the real fall. The collapse of our values, the collapse of our health and prosperity ecosystem. Today, we are wavering between a period of remission and life on artificial respiration. But what was this 20th century architecture you were so keen to defend? To illustrate this, allow me this long quote, conclusion from your book, Miss van der Rohe, published by Hazen in 1994, which I like to dig out of my bookshelf and often read aloud. During 6 decades of fertile political, cultural, and artistic change, Miss built a body of work marked by a constant effort to give rational form, both intellectually and materially, to the programs of the elites committed to transforming society. Using steel and glass, the materials of large-scale industry, in configurations determined by the aesthetic strategies of the avant-garde, and yet marked by the stamp of classicism, Miss elaborated in his initial types and in their declensions categories of buildings as revealing of the capitalist mode of production as the Florentine palaces were of the feudalism of the Quattrocento. Here, more than any other architect of modernity, he is the shaper of modernization, ultimately executing the program that Peter Behance sketched out of the AEG at the turn of the century. In this respect, his work also refers to the other Chicago school, that of the modern social sciences founded at the University of Chicago, based on the crystal that is the city, with its populations and ethnic and social groups, which served as the empirical basis for creating a model of conflict and arbitration with universal pretensions. Thanks to the field of action opened up by the ITT and Greenwald commissions, Miss was also able to elaborate such models. But their reproduction by other architects, escaping the rigor of his control, shows that there was nothing reproducible about them. The mute presence of Marinos Marini's bust of Miss on the first floor of the IBM building in Chicago is ultimately a reflection of his attitude to the world. Carved out of the mass, his solid face is pierced with a sovereign gaze on the century, his mouth frozen between a pout at the mediocrity of the city that surrounds him and a greedy appreciation of the quality of the stones and metal that protect him from it. It's true that I have the nerve to pay tribute to you. I'm not from the Cité de l'Architecture, nor responsible for the architecture pages of a major newspaper, nor am I an architect. But I've come across you too often to give up. You'll forgive me, won't you? This homage is not pompous, it's not reverent, and it's in the first person. That was good, Miss, wasn't it? Dear listeners, thank you for tuning in. Let's meet again next week for a new issue, and until then, take care of yourselves. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening. Thanks to Julien Rebours, sound engineer, who is collaborating with us today. Don't forget to tune in to our previews on Instagram at Comme d'Archi Podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, don't hesitate to promote it by giving it 5 stars and a little comment on Apple Podcast or on your favorite podcast platform. And above all, subscribe to listen to all of our episodes for free. See you soon, and until then, take care of yourself.